will just say thank you at the end. Thank you, Taoiseach.
Thank you very much, Ciarán. I want to thank senators for their contributions, and so many issues have been raised, and in the limited time I have, I'll try and answer as many as I can, but I apologise in advance if I don't do justice to anyone's particular question or any of the issues that were raised. I'll start with housing, which was mentioned by senators, and I think we'll all agree that core to the solution is increased supply of housing of all forms. It's not the solution on its own, but in a country with a growing population, with new households being formed all the time, we evidently need a lot more houses and a lot more apartments. Probably need about 30 to 35,000 new homes being built every year in Ireland, and we are getting there. Last year, 18,000 new homes in Ireland were built, 18,000 new homes and apartments, more than any this decade. And a quarter of the new homes built in Ireland last year were social housing built by local authorities or affordable housing bodies. And I'm not sure when was the last time that either of those things happened, but we need to continue to scale it up. And we've set the target this year of building about 25,000 new places to live, and again, about a quarter of those being social housing, because we need market solutions and non-market solutions to the housing crisis, recognising that very many people, the vast majority of people in fact, do want to own their own home and buy their own home, but there are always going to be people who cannot do that, and that's where the market can't deliver and the state must do so. We'll also have new legislation coming through, which you'll know is being brought through by Minister Murphy and Minister English around further enhancing tenants' rights. And we'll continue to put resources into lifting families out of homelessness. We probably lift more families out of homelessness any year than ever before, but as many become homeless every year, and until we break that cycle, I think we will have real difficulty turning the issue around. But I don't think we should forget for a second where we've come from in terms of this housing crisis, which Ireland has had a situation 8-10 years ago where we had a financial crisis in which the banking sector was destroyed and was unable to lend to people to borrow or builders to build, a construction industry which was destroyed, and 100,000 construction workers who left the country, and rebuilding that and turning that around was never going to be done quickly. No matter who's in office, it's going to take us a few years before we get to the point where we're delivering enough housing for people to buy, and also social housing as well. In relation to health, I know some members mentioned the enormous problems and challenges that we have in healthcare, which I don't discount or dismiss for a second, whether it's overcrowding in emergency departments or long waiting times. But I think we should also provide some time in debates on health to acknowledge some of the good things that are happening in our health service. The phenomenal work done by the 115,000 people who work in our health service, and some of the strategies and policies that are working, and some of the record investment in healthcare, 17 billion a year now, almost more per head than any country in the Western world. And it's not a black hole. A lot of that money is well spent, and it's delivering real results. And just to give you a few small examples, just in the last few weeks, a new contract agreed with staff nurses, providing for a pay increase for them, but more significantly, reforms in work practices that we need to make sure that the patient gets better care, that nurses and doctors are there when the patient needs them and needs them most. At long last, after much effort, an agreement with GPs to increase resources for general practice by 40% over the next 3 to 4 years. And that's not just an increase in funding for general practice, it's new service as well, particularly the management of chronic diseases, the most common chronic diseases in primary care, better care for people in the community, and fewer people in longer term needing to go to hospital. We've had the progressive expansion of free GP care, not as fast as Launch of Care recommends. I don't think any of us honestly believes that extending free GP care to an extra 500,000 people a year is doable. It would overwhelm general practice, so we're doing it slower, but we are doing it. We started with the youngest and oldest in society, those under 6 and those over 70, moved on to children who have profound disabilities, 40,000 of them, who previously would not have got a medical card if their parents earned too much. An amazing situation which was presided over for far too long. Children with profound disabilities losing medical cards because their parents went to work and earned so much that they went over the limit, and we changed that. And now children with profound disabilities, 40,000 of them get a medical card as a right for the first time. extended free GP care last year to those in receipt of carers allowance and carers benefit, because carers need to be cared for too. This year, a 10% increase in the income limits, so more low-income working families qualify for free GP care. And next year, we've signalled our intention, and we will do it, extending free GP care to 6 and 7-year-olds, 8 and 9-year-olds the year after that, and 10 and 11-year-olds the year after that. After almost 20 years in which only one new hospital was built in the country, there are now 3 under construction. We hear a lot about one of them. We don't hear about the other 2, which are happening on time and on budget. Of course, the National Forensic Mental Health Hospital in North County Dublin will get the keys of that this year, replacing the Victorian facilities in Dundrum, and also the new National Rehab Hospital in Dunleary. Again, a huge improvement in our healthcare. 120 primary care centres now across the country operating. This month, a reduction in prescription charges for those over 70 with medical cards, and anyone who doesn't have a medical card, with the DPS threshold being reduced. This year, the number of hospital beds will go back up to 11,000 for the first time since 2009, reversing the policy of previous governments to reduce the number of hospital beds. And that is having some effect. It's not just about beds, because we know that adding beds in hospitals is not the solution on its own. Lots of places it hasn't worked, but it is part of the solution. And we do see this year so far the lowest numbers of people recorded on trolleys in 5 years, and that's still far too many. And I know there are peaks here on different days, and the nature of trolleys is you can always create a new record. The highest Wednesday since last year, or the highest in a particular hospital, but if you take it in the round, the lowest in 5 years this so far. Real improvements in stroke care, cancer care and heart attack. More people surviving cancer now than die from it. And then there's the whole Healthy Ireland initiative. Huge work being done around public health, around healthy eating, around alcohol, legislation that came through this House, for example, on that, which will make a big difference. So that's just a few things that are happening in health that are good, and we should allow, I think, some space for that as well in our debates, because the focus so often is on the negative. And while we shouldn't ignore the problems, I don't think we do a service to the people, our patients, taxpayers, or the staff who work in the health service if we don't allow some space to acknowledge the very good things that are going on. On Seanad reform, like Senator McDougall, I once supported abolition. Lots of countries have unicameral systems, and they seem to manage okay, whether it's Portugal or Finland or New Zealand, for example. But we had a referendum on it. The people decided to keep the Seanad, and that decision is made. And for that reason, I no longer support abolition. And I have read the report done on the implementation of the Manning reforms. I've also read the dissenting reports, or alternative reports, from Fine Gael, from Sinn Féin, from independent senators. And I suppose the question that I have to ask is, does the reform go far enough? Do we really accept that in the 21st century, vocational panels are the right model for a 21st century democracy, when pretty much every democracy in the world tends to operate on national lists, or local constituencies, or regional lists? Do we want to continue to have vocational panels, which largely derive from, I believe, a papal encyclical back from the 1930s? But whatever happens, and I've absolutely no wish to be a barrier to reform. And if there is a majority in the Dáil and this House for what's proposed, I certainly will not stand in the way of that, and I give you that assurance here today. On the issue of the local property tax, I think it was mentioned that homeowners in Dublin and indeed in other cities pay more in their local property tax than those living in smaller towns or more rural counties, and that is of course true, but there is more to the story than that. People living in urban areas receive more local services from their local authorities, whether it's footpaths or street lighting, or whether it's local parks and grass cutting and so on. But I think there is a solution, and I've suggested before, and that is that the local property tax should be retained locally. The money that you pay in your local authority area should go to your local authority and stay in that local authority. We will still need an equalisation fund to make sure that less well-off local authorities don't lose out, but that doesn't need to be funded from the LPT. That can be funded from other forms of taxation. So there is a solution there. LPT staying locally, but continuing to have an equalisation fund funded from general taxation for those counties that need it. and then give the councils the power to vary up and down as they wish. There's a 15% limit there. You can vary up by 15, you can vary down by 15. Interestingly, as many councils have varied up as down. A lot of people probably wouldn't have thought that happened, but whereas some councils have varied down, others, like Longford, for example, have taken the decision to vary up and to invest that money in their counties and in their county towns. So I think we can actually trust local government and councillors to have more autonomy when it comes to the LPT and allow them to vary it by much more, and that's what I would suggest be part of the solution. On guillotines, I think, as I mentioned last year, 6 years as a routine cabinet minister, as a regular cabinet minister across 3 departments, I never had to use the guillotine. Never used it once, even when it was in vogue, when we had a massive majority in the Dáil and Seanad. I'm not sure I ever said it should never be used, because there will be occasions where a minority may try to block the view of the majority, and that's not democratic either. But lest there be any conclusion, or lest there be any doubt about it, the government doesn't impose guillotines. Guillotines can only happen if the Dáil votes for it in the Dáil and the Seanad votes for it in the Seanad. And if this
we rejected it yesterday.
You did indeed. You did, and you were acting within your rights in doing so. And if this House believes that 120 hours for the Judicial Appointments Bill is not enough, that is your decision. And it is. It is entirely open to the House to spend as many hours as the House decides debating the bill. But there's 2 certainties in politics. 2 things are finite: money and time. And if it is the decision of this House to give more time to this particular issue than any of the issues that you mentioned here today, that is your decision, and you must be accountable for that. And that is your decision. Because this is a parliament, you can pass private members' bills, you can pass legislation. And if your decision that during the existence of this Seanad, this is the issue of most importance to you, that is your decision, but you also need to be accountable for it, because I don't have the power to impose any guillotines.
We can extend the sitting time here any time. We can sit 5 days a week if we wish.
I think on the issue of climate action, there are a lot of areas where I think Ireland does well environmentally. We're close to the top of league tables when it comes to things like recycling, for example. We're doing well on wind energy and can do a lot better again. And we have brought through some really important legislation in the past 3 years, largely private members' bill, Tony McLaughlin's bill to outlaw fracking, Thomas Pringle's bill to divest the state from investing in fossil fuels, and also legislation initiated by Senator Sullivan and also the Labour Party around microbeads, which will become law. But there's an obvious area where we're not succeeding, and that is on greenhouse gas emissions, where we need to do much better, where we need to catch up. And I'm very much inspired by the protests that were carried out by young people in recent times, because I know, and I've monitored this and studied this all around the world, that the politics of climate is tricky. We saw what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes. We see where a populist party in Finland in elections this week did very well. And part of their argument was, why is a small country like Finland doing all of this stuff around climate change when the Chinese aren't and the Americans aren't, and so on. We know in Australia that a government and a Prime Minister lost their positions because of carbon tax. So I know the need to deliver on climate change and climate action, but the worst thing you can do in politics is to try to do something and then fail to deliver, not getting a majority. And you need to bring people with you, and that's the real challenge when it comes to climate change. Advocacy is easy. Actually bringing a whole country with you is a bigger deal. But that's why I am inspired by what I saw those children and students and young people doing, because it says to me that there is a critical mass of support. There are people who care about this enough to counterbalance the vested interests on the other side, who will try to stop things from being done. And I really welcome the cross-party report on climate action. And that will inform the government's response to it, and respond to it we will. I think the issue of the D'Souza case was raised, and I strongly agree with the Senator's views on this. The Good Friday Agreement is eloquent. It's one of the best international treaties you could ever read. And we're all in the business of reading treaties. It's a strange job, but it's what we all do. And one of the most wonderful things about the Good Friday Agreement is it's so readable. And there it is in black and white, the right to be Irish or British or both, and accepted as such. And I really think that the British government has got this wrong in relation to the Sousa case, and we're going to examine whether we can intervene in it in some way while respecting their legal system, but certainly at political level we've raised it on a number of occasions and will continue to do so. On the European elections, I suppose the question is moot in many ways, because it appears now that the European elections will happen in Northern Ireland, and people in Northern Ireland will be able to vote in those European elections. But I do think we need to understand the distinction between citizens' rights and the rights of residents and citizens who are resident. There are a lot of EU citizens around the world who don't live in the European Union, and many of them, some do, many of them do not have the right to vote in European elections. And the democratic logic behind that is that parliaments set taxes and parliaments make laws. And if you're not paying those taxes and you're not bound by those laws, should you have the right to elect people to such a parliament? Should people who don't pay EU VAT, should people who don't have to obey European laws elect a parliament? It's not the old-fashioned concept of no taxation without representation. It's a very simple thing. Should I be able to cast a vote that imposes taxes and laws on other people that I don't have to spend or obey? And there is a democratic principle there at play, in my view. The Office of President is different because the President doesn't have such powers and is a representative of the nation. I know on the question of disability, we have, since I was last here, ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I think it's important to acknowledge that one of the reasons why we were one of the last countries to do so was actually a good reason, because we're not a country that just ratifies conventions and then says it's done. We did a lot of things leading up to that. A huge number of legal instruments had to be put in place to ratify the convention so that our ratification was meaningful. Other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, ratified it long before us, but our approach to UN conventions is different. We don't just sign them and then implement them. We implement them and then sign them. But that is not to say that there isn't an ongoing agenda of things that we need to do, convention or no convention, to achieve equality of opportunity for citizens in Ireland who are disabled. And what I want to do is every 2 or 3 years do something meaningful and practical that helps people with disabilities and gives them greater equality of opportunity. And we've done a lot. We've fully restored the disability allowance, for example, fully restored the carers allowance and the carers grant, brought in more respite services, as I mentioned earlier, extended free GP care to carers, extended the medical card to disabled children, have changed the rules around medical cards as well, because a lot of people with disabilities fear losing their medical card if they take up work, and that's a really perverse incentive. And we've changed the rules around that too, and around the travel pass. So we need to do a lot more. I acknowledge that, not least around access to transport, which I know is an enormous issue in public transport in particular. And as well as that, we've set a new target for the employment in the public sector to increase to 6%. The number of people with disabilities working in the public sector. We've achieved 3% already, but we need to go to 6 now. And Mr McGrath is very much leading that. I was kind of glad that the issues of mica and apartments were raised together because they're not unconnected. And we are at the moment working on a scheme to assist people and families in Mayo and Donegal who have mica in their homes, and I've been in those homes and met those people. And that is being worked on, and it will be delivered this year, hopefully in the next couple of weeks or months, but it's not entirely under my control. But pyrite is different to mica. The cost of remediating mica homes is going to be a lot more than was the case for pyrite homes. And also behind that, as Senator Humphreys mentioned, including very many in my constituency, particularly in Dublin and Leinster, by the way, but also in Munster and Connaught as well, about 70,000 people living in apartments that are defective. And the Senator is correct to say that the state needs to help. But sometimes I think the state has no face. Behind the state, there are taxpayers and there are citizens. And taking on the cost of remediating and repairing 70,000 apartments, it's quite a bill. Will mean if we do that, we won't be able to do other things. and they're the real choices that you have to make in government. So anything we do, whether it's assisting people whose homes are affected by mica, whether it's assisting people who live in defective apartment buildings, we have to know the cost. We have to work out what contribution would come from the taxpayer and what would come from the owners of those homes themselves. And we have to consider what other things as a consequence of that we can't do. And that's the realpolitik that I face every day in government, which I understand is not the case when you're not in government, but that's the place that I operate in, and government does too. And we make those decisions every day. Which two things do we do, and which two things do we also want to do, but now we can't do? And that's the hard part of the job, but a job I love nonetheless. In terms of the issues around regional development, Senator Mulhern mentioned Athenry, and I was really crestfallen that the Athenry development didn't go ahead. It would have been the biggest single private sector investment in the west of Ireland ever, alongside the biggest ever public sector investment in the west of Ireland, which was the Gortachune motorway. And we shouldn't forget that the biggest ever capital investment in the state in the past 10 years anyway was in rural Ireland, in the west of Ireland. It was the Gortachune motorway. Motorway cost more than Newlands Cross, the N11 and Lewis Cross City combined. So anyone who's saying that we're not investing in transport in rural Ireland or the west of Ireland needs to know that fact. But having done that massive public investment, this would have been a massive private investment. I don't think it should be considered typical. All over the country, planning permission is being granted for data centres. So it isn't typical. And we did win the case, and it's an important point of law. And I did use the opportunity when I was in Cork last week to raise it with Apple. And they said that they would engage with the IDA. Perhaps they may want to use it still themselves in the future, although they've no immediate need for it now. But if they're not going to use it, well then perhaps by engaging with the IDA they could sell it on to another tech company who will. So I don't think that investment is lost, by the way, and I think we need to work on it still. On road infrastructure, again, as people will know, the vast majority of the road budget now is invested in rural Ireland and in the regions. Somebody mentioned to me yesterday that 10% of the entire roads budget this year is in Donegal and the other 10% in Sligo. So 20% of the entire roads budget in two counties in the northwest and very rural counties too. If you look at what's going to be completed this year in Wexford, the new Ross bypass and the Enniscorthy bypass, and what's starting this year has started already, the N4 to Sligo and also Dunkettle and Cork. You'll see that the major road investment that's happening is now all outside of the Dublin region and very much around the country. And we need to press ahead with the Galway out-of-city bypass in particular too, and those improvements. And I very much share the sentiments of Senator Mulhern in that regard. We have to balance the need to protect our environment and the need to protect habitats with the need to realise that humans have a habitat too and have socio-economic needs, and they need to be considered as well. Finally, on the issue of the family reunification bill, I will give that consideration when we see the report. I come across individual cases, as senators do, and I'm enormously sympathetic to those cases. But as is always the case with any law, there's the law of unintended consequences. And if it's a modest measure, we should do it. But if it opens the door to much more, then we need to be very cautious about it, because migration is a really good thing. You know, I'm a product of migration. I wouldn't exist were it not for the fact that both my parents migrated to England. Our public services wouldn't operate without migrants. Our economy would not be as strong without migrants. I was in Apple in Cork last week. Half the workforce were Irish, the other half were non-Irish, and Apple wouldn't be there if they didn't have access to that workforce. And that's worth €250 million in payroll alone to Cork. You know, massive money. And of course, as well as that, migrants have helped to enhance our society and made Ireland a much more interesting place. But at the same time, we can't have uncontrolled migration. And I know nobody, or very few people anyway, other than on the very far left, are arguing for that. And we do need to bear in mind that any legislation we bring through, that it doesn't create chain migration, that it doesn't create problems for the common travel area with the UK, that it doesn't create problems with the European Union around freedom for movement. And if we're confident that it doesn't do any of those things, well then it's something that I'd like to support and definitely have an open mind on. Finally, on the issue of pay for defence forces, I know this is a huge issue. Recruitment in the defence forces is actually going very well. but retention is not, because there are now enormous opportunities in the private sector, whether it's pilots leaving Baldonnel for Ryanair, whether it's engineers in Cork leaving the Navy for the private sector. We're losing really good people from our defence forces, and we need to act on that. We are acting on it by having rolling recruitment now. We're acting on it by allowing people who've left to come back. Actually, a lot of people leave the defence forces, want to come back. They couldn't do that up until recently. Now they can. We're really encouraging recruitment among female members of society joining our defence forces. We are restoring pay in the same way as pay is being restored for public servants across the board, is being restored for our defence forces. But there are particular issues around particular allowances, which, if restored or enhanced, could make a real difference for the defence forces. And I met in recent weeks with the head of the Public Sector Pay Commission, and he's given me an assurance that they'll be able to give us an interim report next month, and government will respond to that and will act on it. So once again, thanks for your contributions, and thanks for the really important work that you do for our state here.
Thank you.